Welcome to the Pulse Debit Regulations Resource Center. I'm Steve Sievert with Pulse Marketing and Communications, and joining me today is Tony Hayes, partner at Oliver Wyman. Today we'll discuss results from the 2012 Debit Issuer Study commissioned by Pulse and conducted by Oliver Wyman, and specifically we'll look at the impact of Regulation II on issuers and how financial institutions are coping with regulatory change. Tony, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you.
The Federal Reserve's Regulation II caps the maximum interchange that financial institutions with at least $10 billion in assets can receive on debit card transactions. This change went into effect last October, and as a result, average signature debit interchange has plunged 55% for these so-called regulated issuers. So, Tony, significant changes in the industry. How are these issuers coping with the change in debit economics?
Let's talk about the numbers first. You mentioned the 55% drop. That's on signature debit, as you pointed out, when it went from an average of 52 cents per transaction down to 24 cents per transaction. And in the case of PIN debit, from 32 cents down to 23 cents. So the first change is, while the revenue is now the same between signature and PIN, the costs remain very different. Signature debit remains a more expensive product for issuers, and as a result, we're seeing many issuers change their focus, and they're trying to emphasize PIN debit over signature debit, or at a minimum be agnostic in terms of how the card is used, because in terms of margin, PIN debit has higher margins and is more profitable to issuers than signature debit is. A complete reversal than the past. Secondly, we should talk about business debit. Business debit went from an average of interchange of $2.10 down to only 26 cents. Massive reduction in revenue. So while in the past issuers were focused on business debit, were focused on higher value transactions, now a seismic shift over to consumer debit and much more focus on small value, lower ticket transactions. The third area we see in terms of focus or change in strategy is around rewards programs. A number of issuers had traditional rewards programs that they funded to try and drive incremental spend, promote loyalty. Almost all of those have now gone by the wayside. There's simply not enough money in debit anymore for the large issuers to fund these programs. And then last, but certainly not least, many issuers are trying to expand their horizons and saying maybe we should look at other payment products beyond debit that may have better revenue potential. And in particular, general purpose reloadable prepaid seems to offer a lot of opportunity, and we see a number of large banks actively exploring that area.
So, Tony, let's transition to talk about the impact on exempt issuers. What findings did you see there from the study?
We asked a number of exempt issuers what they've seen in terms of interchange, and so far the results have been minimal at best. Because remember, Reg II is a cap, it's not a minimum, and it only applies to issuers with more than $10 billion in assets. So if you're exempt, debit is and remains a very attractive category, still lots of growth potential, and we see lots of plans to continue to invest in the space to try and drive growth and drive continued spend on debit cards.
Certainly, when it comes to economics, a dichotomy between large and small financial institutions, but issuers of all sizes were impacted by the network participation provision of Reg II. What are some of the impacts that you're seeing from that provision?
The fact is that the majority of FIs were already compliant with the network affiliation rule. Most FIs already had cards that were in two unaffiliated networks. But for those that weren't, they had one of three choices. They could change their signature debit network affiliation, they could change their PIN debit network affiliation, or they could add an independent PIN network. And what we see, with one notable exception, is the majority of FIs that needed to make a change have added an additional PIN network in order to move into compliance.
And lastly, I'd like to talk about the impact of merchant routing. How has that played out so far in the industry?
Right, that's a great question. And really, I think, speaks to your earlier question around interchange for exempt issuers. The fact is that Durbin has really changed the landscape from an environment where transaction routing was determined by networks and issuers to one where routing is determined by merchants and their processors. And as a result, what we see is routing is changing on a merchant by merchant, network by network basis, almost on a daily basis. So material shifts in terms of where the volume is flowing. And what we heard through the study is a number of exempt issuers are now quite concerned about the way this may play out. There's a concern that different networks may choose to reduce the revenue they deliver to the issuers in turn to try and attract routing. We haven't seen evidence of that to any material degree so far, but I guess I would just say let's see how the next year's study plays out, because that certainly is something that we're watching very carefully.
Well, great. Tony, really appreciate your time today and sharing your insights from the study.
Thank you.
And Pulse participants can get a copy of the executive summary of the Debit Issuer Study on the Pulse website. You can find it at pulsenetwork.com/research. Thanks for joining us today.